although I'm not expecting this election to be a sudden epiphany, if you like, of economic rationality, that suddenly this government starts doing everything right. I am seeing it as the first step in a long road ahead of South Africa moving back out of the troubled waters that it's been in over the recent years.
Welcome to ETM Group's discussion on the economic impact of the election outcome. We're more or less a month away from the elections happening. Watershed moment for South Africa, definitely the biggest since we've had in 1994. And while everyone is trying to roll the dice to figure out where the votes will land and what the political landscape will look like post 29 May, ETM Group has decided to pull some of its expertise and try and attempt to paint a landscape for the economy and the markets and the currency post 29 May. And for that, we roped in some of our best ETM Analytics Director and Head of Research, George Glynos. Also from Econometrix, we have the Director and Chief Economist, Azar, Jammine, and then also Econometrix Senior Economist, Jeff. Thank you very much for joining us, guys. So we're going to start this with a Q&A basis, but before we get there, just a very quick run through again of the election scenarios that we kind of discussed in-house, came up with, drew up some scenarios around. Obviously, the one is the ANC gets majority again, which means we most likely can expect more of the same over the next 4 years for the trek of the economy. Then we move into a more unfamiliar territory, and that would be a coalition government, whether that be ANC narrowly missing the 50% plus one mark, so they could enter in a coalition with the IFP. Maybe they need some assistance from the DA. And that, of course, is a scenario that we view as one of the more market-friendly outcomes of the election. And then the other coalitions that are unlikely, but still in the realm of possibility, I suppose, is any ANC coalition involving the EFF as well as MK. And this is something that we view as a less market-friendly outcome for the election. So those are kind of the scenarios that we are working with, and it makes things tricky. But I'm going to still pose questions, and we can talk about it. We're not necessarily going to agree on all of it, but just to see and where and how the landscape possibly could look post 29 May for the financial markets in South Africa. So, George, I'm going to ask you for one of the first questions, and it's a question that's popped up in another webinar that I was involved with. Following the elections, we know uncertainty is always baked into election, especially like this in South Africa, where the outcome is a bit uncertain at this point in time. Could we see some of the rand weakness subside following the elections once that kind of uncertainty has been removed?
Yeah, so Ilze-Marie, I think it's a good point to make up front, because there is quite a lot of bad news that's already priced into these markets. We can see it in the way that it's factored into options pricing. So the volatility skew, in other words, if you have a look at the way that these options are priced just after the elections and pre the elections, there's a big divergence between the two, which confirms that there has already been hedging that's been put in place. And that hedging is very much skewed towards rand weakness. We can also see it in the way that the futures markets have traded, the rates markets have traded. There is quite a lot of negative risk, if you like, priced into the rand post the elections. And I think that's just the fund managers being super cautious and positioning themselves to ensure that the worst case scenario, if it does come to pass, is not going to affect their portfolios too much. The flip side to that is if you get a constructive outcome, in other words, a market-friendly outcome, all of that has to unwind. So those will start to fall away. The hedges will be removed. And that in itself is going to propel the rand to much stronger levels. And as it does so, you build up a natural momentum to that move. So it depends on the outcome to some degree, obviously. But if you get a multi-party coalition, for example, that still has the ANC in the lead, but that perhaps teams up with the IFP and maybe a DA in various guises, I think that would be seen as really constructive. And I suspect that the rand would rally pretty strongly on an outcome like that.
Yes, Azar.
Ilze-Marie, if I could say, there is one proviso here. That is that South Africans currently generally have a very negative view of the stability of coalition governments based on the chaotic experience that we have had in some of the coalitions at provincial and municipal level in recent years. And therefore, the counter to George's conclusion about the rand strengthening dramatically is that there could be a view of, yes, we won't trash the rand right now, but let's wait and see whether this coalition can actually work or not. And that could take quite a while to actually pan out. But I agree that there is a temptation to believe that the initial knee-jerk reaction will be for the rand to strengthen a lot. I think back in particular to the ousting of President Zuma and his replacement by President Ramaphosa in February 2018. The rand rallied dramatically from 14.5 to 11.5 to the dollar in a space of 6 weeks or whatever the case may be. And yet many of us were warning, listen, there's still huge problems. The structural problems are still likely to prevail. But I had interactions with quite a few foreign investors at the time, foreign bankers who said, no, this is a new dawn for South Africa. And it didn't turn out to pass. So that's something that we're going to have to just be a little wary of. It's just a flag that I'm putting there.
Yeah,
it is going to be.
I think Ilze-Marie, if I can just jump in there, I think Azar makes very, very valid points, because there's the question marks about how much is going to change from a policy perspective. I just want to truncate the reaction that we are seeing is very much just a positioning thing. So it's a positioning thing into the elections and a positioning thing that is going to unwind post the elections. So it's literally a mechanical event that I'm flagging, as opposed to a sort of a more medium to longer term assessment that Azar was referring to.
And like I said, it will have to be a wait and see moment for the markets, because one thing needs to be clear is, should it result in a coalition government, I think it will take another 2 weeks after we have the results before the coalition lines will start really becoming clear, when the newly sworn in MPs will head into Parliament and vote for the new president. Then, only then, we will really start to see what a possible coalition could look like, unless someone, of course, comes out and makes a statement saying, okay, these are the guys we'll be partnering with. Only then will it become clear exactly who is working together and who is not. So even if we're voting on the 29th of May, even when we have the results, there's no reason for a knee-jerk reaction until things become a bit more clear, which will take time as that flesh out.
In that regard, Ilze-Marie, there is a view that says that 2 weeks for these political parties to sort out what they want and plan a sustainable coalition is far too short. And there are moves afoot to try and delay this 2-week window to make it a longer window. I don't know if you're aware of anything to that in that regard.
That's going to be interesting.
Because they say that if you force these people to reach a coalition within 2 weeks, you then get bad planning, bad coalitions, bad contracts between them. And so the coalitions tend to fail.
Well, maybe backdoor discussions are happening already. It's still politicians. Jeff, I would like to come to you quickly on the next question. So, once again, I think this came out of an Econometrix webinar that we were involved with last week. 2024 is obviously the theme of inflation and when the interest rates will start coming down. We saw them pushed back towards the end of the year for South Africa, possibly only next year. But one of the questions was asked that, should we see a less market-friendly coalition come to the fore, how could this impact interest rate movements, if at all, given the current expectations around rate cuts?
Hey, Ilze. Yeah, I think the trickiness is coming back to what George and Azar are speaking about is primarily what manifests in the macro environment from the political environment. So what are the actual impacts? And in the short term, even a market unfriendly coalition. So let's take a worse, the less market friendly case of an ANC, MK, EFF sort of coalition. The question then is what is the immediate impact on that? And obviously the first one would be sentiment, which affects the rand. It affects the consumer spending side of things. And then further down the line, you would probably only then start to see policy implications. So actual structural shifts in the way that the SA economy grows and where we get those weaknesses are probably only going to come further down the line. So the immediate knee-jerk reaction would be a rand sell-off, probably a very short, sudden stop to any of the investment that's happening in SA, at least until some clarity is reached. So how that affects the interest rates, you've got to look at something like an inflation pass-through effect. And that would be the most immediate linkage. So under a weaker rand exchange rate, obviously all the goods and services that we need to import, predominantly fuel would be the biggest one, would start to have these inflationary consequences to which the SARB would have to respond. When you start spinning these negative scenarios, you also have to question things like, well, what happens to the SARB? But at least in the short term, you need to keep assuming SARB independence, and the SARB reacts in the way that it always has done. And it would react, obviously, to a surge in inflation by probably pushing up the interest rate quite sharply. And we would need to pivot from interest rate cuts being pushed out to next year to probably a period of 1 or 2 sharp interest rate hikes towards the end of the year, and then probably at least flat for a period of time until we see how that plays out. But the SARB is leaning statements, their own data, that they are leaning more and more hawkish. So the data that they're putting forward and their narrative is that inflationary pressures are already pre-election much more persistent, much higher for longer than we expected. And so really a market unfriendly election outcome, a rand sell-off, higher pass-through inflation, gives them more than enough ammunition to shift into a hiking mode again. And I think that would be easily justifiable by the end of this year.
And I think it's so important. Yeah, sorry, George.
Yeah, you could add an element of fiscal risk that comes into a coalition like that, because we've seen what far left-leaning scenarios can do to budget deficits, and in fact we were having this discussion just offline before this webinar, where Azar was highlighting the amount or the number of countries around the world running enormous budget deficits. So the message there is that the markets would reward countries that are running prudent, conservative fiscal policy, not countries that do the exact opposites. And I fear that if we had to get that sort of an ugly coalition, as I would call it, that's a coalition that would probably bring a much higher risk profile to the country, which is exactly what we don't need now. If you have a look at the way that your interest rate structures tend to move, your bonds will factor that in very, very quickly. And in short succession, your government is going to be paying a lot more for its debt than it was prior to the election. And so that's not an outcome we want, and it's something that we hope we ultimately avoid. But it's an inflation issue for sure. It's a currency issue for sure, but it's also a fiscal issue.
Jeff, you touched on, we're assuming the Reserve Bank independence, and ultimately when we have these type of discussions and, there are these less market-friendly outcomes that could possibly happen, including someone like the EFF, who has been very vocal about nationalizing the Reserve Bank. The obvious question is, how big is the risk to the Reserve Bank's independence when something like that happens? And, we saw this with the headline as well, that poll headline about the MK surge, and we saw this quick rand sell-off that happened afterwards. And again, I just want to state things like this, like the Reserve Bank's independency, things like less market-friendly policy changes that can happen, is not something that can happen in the short, struggling even to make it in the medium term sometimes. Things South Africa is still this massive ship. And if there's any policy change, whether on the fiscal side, monetary policy side, any Chapter 9 institution change that needs to happen, the Reserve Bank nationalization, these things take time. Government has structures. It's not that easy to move into the union buildings and, just call for policy changes to happen. So again, I just want to warn that, there's no need for knee-jerk reactions when these type of things happen. For policies to change, it still needs to go through public discussion. We have a very vocal and active civil society who is more than willing to take the government to court and fight them on legislation changes. So I think my words when it comes to the risk around the Reserve Bank's independence and policy changes around that and nationalization is just to calm down and breathe and understand that there's a massive process to go through before anything of that type of thing really materializes. I don't know, but I don't know if anyone else wants to speak to the fear of the independence of the Reserve Bank.
Maybe if I could just jump in there. So I would tend to agree with you, Ilze, and I think that that's the prudent way of thinking about things under this, since we're talking about the third scenario here. This is the prudent way to think about things, is that there's a rigidity to the system of change, and that manifests slowly, even to more radical policies.
And that is both a good and a bad thing, by the way.
It is a good, it's good in a case like this that you're laying out. But at the same time, I do think we need to be open to the idea that government has tools at its disposal that civil society doesn't. It sets policy and it can back that policy up with force if needs be. And yes, it's maybe one step removed from where we are now, absolutely. But a government who came into power in that third scenario, you need to assume that for whatever reason, the ANC ideology shifts so strongly that it sees the MK or the EFF as a bedfellow that it wants to align with. That's not the same ANC that would respect necessarily the rule of law or the court system. It's also not the sort of ANC or the leading party that would necessarily be against pushing legislation through on its majority without any feedback or any kind of mechanism or escape valve through civil society, lobby groups, advocacy groups. These guys work when the system that they integrate into works. And we've seen through history, if there is a persistent, relentless government who wants to change that system and that structure, it can do so quickly. So again, I'm not saying that that's a likely scenario, but I think if we're thinking about this ANC EFF shift, why would they form a coalition? Well, it's clearly to accelerate some sort of very left-leaning vision, and if they really want to give that speed and put that to reality, that can be done fairly quickly.
Azar, you wanted to mention?
Yeah, just as a point of information, it was interesting last night listening to an interview with the spokesman of the Mkhonto weSizwe party, and he spoke out very strongly that they are in favor of nationalization of the Reserve Bank. So they combine very well with the EFF, no question. And last week, Julius Malema himself said he has no qualms about entering into an alliance with the Mkhonto weSizwe, that their thinking is very much along the same lines. So effectively, we've had the split of the ANC down the middle already, in a way, between the populists on the one hand and those who are in favor of a more temperate and centrist approach.
George, should we see a more market-friendly outcome, maybe an ANC, IFP, some part DA coalition come out of this, which is one that, like I said, we consider more market-friendly? How long before we can actually see visible improvements from such a strong alliance move into the South African economy?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of context here, because there have been some signs of improvement over the past 18 months in a way that I haven't seen in the prior sort of 8.5 years. And here I'm referring to inclusion of the private sector as a solution to some of these state-owned enterprise problems. And we're referring to Eskom and the privatization by stealth, if you like, not necessarily selling off assets, but including the private sector the solution. We've got the Philippines company coming in and helping to run the ports. We've got Transnet that's in the process of reforming, PRASA that's brought some trains back online. So, there's obviously a concern around water articulation and water affairs. That's potentially the next one that needs assistance. But there have been some positive signs there. Over and above that, we've also seen greater movement from the likes of some of the law enforcement bodies. So the MPA has been a little more active in the past year, 18 months, and the SIU has been a lot more active in the past 6 to 9 months. And I see those as encouraging signs. So that's all small incremental steps in the right direction. And I would like, if it's one thing that I would like out of a coalition government, it's that the individual partners seek to hold each other to account. So if we can get that right and just bring some sanity back to fiscal discussions and not constantly target things that are at this point unaffordable for this country, like potentially the NHI, then I think you start to inject a reality and credibility back into not just the fiscal space, but into the broader perception of management of this country, and that goes a long way to encouraging foreigners to take South Africa seriously. Equally, the other point to make is that there's been some progress made on the grey listing. So, of the 15 action points, they've already covered about 10 of them. National Treasury's been pushing pretty hard on that front, and I believe there's another 5 odd to go. They're looking at completing that through 2025. So that's something else that's walking back from the brink, if you like, but it's a step in the right direction. So there are positive things that are afoot. It's been, in some instances, forced on the ANC because of the lack of funding and because of the loss of support. But those are positive. And so what I would want to see is a harder push in that same direction by all accounts. And I'm sure Azar and Jeff would have plenty to say on this. There's lots more that can be done to unshackle this country from inefficiencies and graft and corruption and rent seeking and all of that. We know there's plenty that can still be done, but I would be looking for a harder push in the kind of directions that I've been seeing more recently. I would take that at this point as a constructive, positive step forward, and one that I think would alleviate a lot of pressure on domestic markets.
Azar, do you think we're making some headway? And what is the one pressing point that you could add still for them to improve on, so the South African economy can finally get underway?
Without a doubt, George is absolutely spot on, and I'm glad he mentioned water reticulation, because that is another big challenge. We keep concentrating on electricity and energy and logistics, but water is now a really important thing. The other one that I think does bear mentioning is fighting crime and sabotage. I'm encouraged in one respect. I get the impression that some of the improvement in the load shedding scenario is a function of actually a reduction in the degree of sabotage at our electricity installations following a change in leadership in that organization. But we need to go a lot further, in particular tackling the construction mafia. And that's quite a tall order. That is necessary if we're going to get infrastructural investment really going in the future. And then, of course, from a longer term point of view, we need to improve the emphasis on amelioration of our educational outcomes, left, right, and center, because that lies at the heart of the lack of skills in the country. And then, obviously, one of the important things that will come out of this election that will be a big challenge is, can we start improving the competence and rollout of service delivery by municipalities? That is where the real weakness has actually resided in recent years. A lot of it due to misdirected cadre deployment. But, one would hope that a coalition government would start tackling some of these issues. We're not looking for wholesale change of the public service and municipal services, but certainly a progressive approach towards ameliorating the competence of these organizations.
I think I would like to pose one last question, perhaps to all three of you. Jeff, starting with you on this one. If you are a South African business, international investor, looking at this elections coming up, what's the one thing that you think that they should keep in mind?
Well, let me take the view that seems to characterize me in the group, but to be cautious. I think South Africans as a whole are hopeful. We're always hopeful. It's in our national spirit, and it's something that makes us a great country. And I think that's reflected in the way that business also views things, and it's definitely the way that I see things when I chat to clients. But I think we need to be prudently cautious here. We need to be rational about just how much change a single election can deliver. I think we saw it with the Ramaphosa 2017. Azar spoke about the Rand, but we saw it in consumer confidence as well. It was this amazing burst of optimism, which then promptly collapsed. And I think we just have to be cautious about saying a single election can deliver South Africa a new dawn, a new environment, a sunrise economy. Yes, it can start to affect things on the margins, but even our best case forecasts see growth only really picking up from 2027. And that's under a situation where you do get a constructive coalition between, let's say, the ANC and the DA, where there's some accountability being introduced. The erosion that's taken place in the capital infrastructural bedrock that is SA, that all needs to be rebuilt first. You need to shift things like governance culture, delivering just simple electricity, water, sanitation to people who live in rural towns, education. All of that stuff is going to take time. So just be hopeful, but be rationally hopeful. And I think that's reflected in our forecast, which, of course, our clients all have access to.
Azar, yours. I see you're smiling.
Yes, and I know the cynicism that underlies Jeff's views, but I totally agree with that. It's going to take a while to unwind a lot of the damage that has already been inflicted on the economy by state capture. In the same way as we only started seeing the full damaging effects of state capture around about 2013, after the process had been going on for the better part of 4 or 5 years. So similarly, unwinding and starting to see an improvement in the economy may take that kind of amount of time. But I'd like to think that in exactly the same way as I identify the 16th of December 2007 as a critical turning point for the worse in South Africa's economic fortunes, that is the ANC conference in Polokwane, I would like to think that the 29th of May 2024 will likewise turn out to be conversely the fundamental turning point that starts seeing things gradually improving, and South Africa actually fulfilling its undoubted potential. You've got to bear in mind that the very diversity of the country is a source of enormous strength. Ironically, that was the motto of the old National Party government, but unity is strength, but unity in diversity. But I really do believe that that diversity is helping to sustain optimism and introduces a whole lot of checks and balances that actually prevent things from collapsing completely. And I think we are going to see the manifestation of that in the election. So I am reasonably hopeful that next month might start marking the turning point in our economic fortunes.
George, what should the currency markets, importers, exporters, traders, what should they keep in mind about the landscape post 29 May?
So I think, just in extending what Azar was saying a little further, I would remind people that every journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step, and I think we've already taken some positive steps, and I'm a really firm believer in the power of a free market unshackled, and we're starting to see some of the effects of that come through in the way that private sector is getting more involved, more stuck in, and its voice is starting to grow again. So we're not just being silenced by ideologues and government that are pushing a very populist narrative. We're now starting to deal with the reality of South Africa's situation, and I think that is a very good place to be. It builds a far better foundation than what we've had for, I would say, the better part of a decade now. So I'm quietly optimistic that this, like Azar signaled, is going to be the start of an improving trend. I'm also realistic about it. In Jeff's sort of vein, I don't believe that we're just going to suddenly see an overnight success emerge out of South Africa just because we have an ANC below 50% and some coalition politics. And I mean, coalitions, as Azar alluded to, can sometimes be fraught with difficulties. But if that coalition is a coalition that is a constructive one and is in the best interests of the country overall, then I think South Africa, if it continues down this current path, is on a much better wicket. And roll forward 5 years, or perhaps at the end of the next election phase, at the next elections, I think we're going to potentially be staring at quite a different environment than what we have right now. And so, I'm quietly optimistic, and I think that if we move in the right directions, reduce crime, corruption, bring some accountability back, keep working with the private sector to unshackle efficiencies, such that we can reduce inflation, help Lesetja Kganyago target a lower inflation rate, stabilize your prices, your currency, all of a sudden there's a lot of positivity that springs off of that, and that I think can lead us to a more stable position than we are right now. So although I'm not expecting this election to be a sudden epiphany, if you like, of economic rationality, that suddenly this government starts doing everything right, I am seeing it as the first step in a long road ahead of South Africa moving back out of the troubled waters that it's been in over the recent years.
Could I add an amusing and interesting little anecdote? Do you know that over the past week or so, South Africa has suddenly regained its position as the largest economy in Africa? Why? Because ironically, the rand has been much more stable than the naira and the Egyptian pound. The latter two have depreciated by 50% and something like 35% each, respectively. And suddenly, the rand's depreciation of 4% since the beginning of the year is minuscule in comparison. And so our GDP in dollar terms has now overtaken that of Nigeria and Egypt. But I mention this simply to show that there is an element of stability about the South African economy that some other emerging markets don't actually enjoy.
Yeah, and we will celebrate even the small wins and everything in between. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me on this discussion. There's been a lot of noise around the election. It's only going to get worse, and I think we've managed to move through some of it. Of course, if any of the viewers have questions, please pose them, and we will get around to answering some of it. But it's going to be a different South Africa come post 29 May. So it's very important, obviously, for everyone to go out and vote, because the changes and the impact will be at the margins. So, but let's remain optimistic that this election really poses the turning point of what has been a very dramatic and destructive past decade for South Africa. Gentlemen, thank you very much, and we will definitely catch up post 29 May.